Hey guys, Ms. Sailor here. So we're going to be talking about the rise of King Cotton as well as the internal slave trade. So in the Midwest, large-scale commercial agriculture emerged as big farms were raising corn, wheat, pigs, and cattle to be sold in distant markets and across the Atlantic. Now in the South, cotton had become so profitable that it increasingly dominated the region's economy. It lured farmers and planters into the new states. See, cotton from the American South provided most of the clothing for people around the world. As the cotton economy expanded, it required more enslaved workers, many of whom were sold by professional slave traders and relocated from Virginia and the Carolinas to the old Southwest. Western Georgia and the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Meanwhile, as I mentioned before, the Northeast is experiencing a surge of industrial development. You have sewing machines, water and steam-powered industries that are reshaping that region's economic and social life. Mills and factories that begin to transform the way people labored, the way they dressed, the way they ate, the way they lived. Now, Southern-grown cotton became the dominant force driving both the national economy and the controversial efforts to expand slavery into the Western territories. Cotton, or white gold, brought wealth to Southern planters and merchants as well as New England mill owners. Cotton became America's largest exported product and the primary driver of the nation's extraordinary economic growth. After the War of 1812, you have this growing understanding, or let me back up. In growing cotton in the 1790s, planters in Virginia and Maryland owned 56% of all slaves in the United States. Now, by 1860, they owned only 15%. This is because cotton was creating a boom time. Over into the southern states. They're moving away from tobacco and into specifically these southern regions. So in the antebellum era, that is the years before the Civil War, American planters in the South continued to grow tobacco and the Carolinas were growing rice. But cotton, however, emerged as the antebellum South's major commercial crop. It eclipsed tobacco, rice, and sugar in economic importance. By 1860, the region was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton. See, in 1793, Eli Whitney revolutionized the production of cotton when he invented the cotton gin, the device that separated the seeds from raw cotton. So it's labor where it had been labor intensive, it could be completed quickly and easily, so it helps feed this. Now, as a commodity, cotton had the advantage of being easily stored and transported. A demand for it already existed in the industrial textile mills in Great Britain, and in time, a steady stream of slave-grown American cotton would also supply northern textile mills. Now, almost no cotton was grown in the United States in 1787. That is the year the federal Constitution was written. However, following the War of 1812, a huge increase in production resulted in the so-called cotton boom, and it becomes a key cash crop. So, because of this, by 1850, of the 3.2 million slaves in the country's 15 slave states, 1.8 are involved in the production of cotton itself. Now, cotton planting took place in March and April when slaves planted seeds in rows around 3 to 5 feet apart. Over the next several months, they carefully tended the plants. Typically, they would begin harvesting in August after the plant had flowered. Cotton planters projected the amounts of cotton they could harvest based on the number of slaves under their control. In general, they expected slaves to work 10 acres of land and pick up to 200 pounds of cotton a day. Now, cotton picking occurred as many as 7 times a season as the plant grew and continued to produce bolls through fall and early winter. So during the picking season, slaves worked from sunrise to sunset with a 10-minute break at lunchtime. The slaves' day, of course, did not end after they picked the cotton. Once they had brought it to the gin house to be weighed, they then also had to care for animals and perform other chores. Now, as the cotton industry boomed in the South, the Mississippi River quickly becomes the essential water highway in the United States. Steamboats, a crucial part of the transportation revolution thanks to their enormous freight carrying capability and abilities to navigate shallow waterways, became the defining component of the Cotton Kingdom. They also illustrate the class and social distinctions of the antebellum age. So investors poured huge sums of money into steamships. In 1817, only 17 were in the waters of the western rivers, but by 1837, 20 years later, there are over 700 in operation. Major new ports also developed. You have St. Louis and Memphis, Tennessee, and other locations. So by 1860, some 3,500 vessels are streaming in and out of New Orleans, carrying an annual cargo made up primarily of cotton that amounted to about $220 million worth of goods. Now I do want to talk about a little New Orleans here. New Orleans had the largest slave market in the United States. The selling of slaves was a major business enterprise in the antebellum South, representing a key part of the economy. The domestic slave trade was highly visible, and like the infamous Middle Passage that brought captive Africans to America, it constituted an equally disruptive and horrifying journey now called the Second Middle Passage. Between 1820 and 1860, white American traders sold 1 million or more slaves in the domestic slave market. Now, the domestic slave trade comes out of originally in 1807 when the U.S. Congress abolished the foreign slave trade. The ban goes into effect January 1st, 1808. So after this date, importing slaves from Africa is illegal. While smuggling did occur, really it gave birth to this domestic slave trade that exploded. Now, it offers more economic opportunities to white men. People realize they can sell their slaves for great profits, so you have slave brokers who serve as middlemen between sellers and buyers. Now, typically this is Virginia and Maryland. When they were tobacco farmers, they begin selling their slaves to cotton plantations in the lower South for prices. Now, Southern whites frequently relied upon the idea of paternalism. That is, the idea that white slaveholders acted in the best interest of slaves, taking responsibility for their care, feeding, discipline, and even their Christian morality to justify the existence of slavery. Now, this grossly misrepresents the reality of slavery, which was by any measure dehumanizing, traumatizing, and horrifying. It was a crime against humanity. Nevertheless, though, slaves are hardly passive victims in their conditions. They did seek and find ways to resist their shackles and develop their own communities and cultures. Slaves sometimes use this notion of paternalism to their advantage, finding opportunities within the system to engage in acts of resistance and win a degree of freedom and autonomy. For example, slum slaves would play into their master's racism by hiding their intelligence and pretending to be ignorant. The slaves could then slow down the workday and sabotage the system by accidentally breaking tools. So the master, seeing his slave as unsophisticated and childlike, would believe these incidents were accidents rather than acts of rebellion. Now, some would engage in more dramatic forms of resistance, such as poisoning their masters. But slaveholders would use both psychological coercion and physical violence to prevent slaves from disobeying their wishes. Often the most efficient way to discipline slaves was to threaten to sell them. Now, complicating the picture of the antebellum South was the existence of large free black populations. In fact, more free blacks lived in the South than in the North. Roughly 261,000 lived in slave states, while 226,000 lived in northern states without slavery. Most freed blacks did not live, though, in the lower or deep South. They typically lived in the upper southern states like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. Part of the reason for such a large number of freed blacks living in slave states were the instances of manumission. That is the formal granting of freedom to slaves that occurred as a result of the Revolution. Many slaveholders put into action this idea of that all men are created equal and freed their slaves. Also, you have another large group of freed blacks in the South that had been free residents of Louisiana before the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, so they remained. Now, freed blacks typically lived in the cities. They organized socially around churches, they competed with white workers for jobs, and they attended separate schools. I will mention also there were at least two major slave uprisings that did occur in the antebellum South as acts of rebellion. In 1811, a major rebellion broke out in the sugar parishes of the booming territory of Louisiana, inspired by the successful overthrow of white planter class in Haiti. So you have Louisiana slaves that took up arms led by Charles Delons. The revolt happened in January of 1811. It did not last long. But the second one is the more known rebellion, which was led by Nat Turner in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner had suffered not only from personal enslavement, but also from the additional trauma of having his wife sold away from him. So, in August of 1831, he bolsters his friends and relatives, and they begin the rebellion, killing scores of whites in the county. Now, it took 48 hours before they had the rebellion put down, but Virginia state legislators, so shocked by Nat Turner's rebellion, actually considered ending slavery in the state in order to provide greater security. Now, in the end, they decide it would remain, but it does create slave codes. That's why on this right side we have slaves' lifestyles. They cannot gather in things like large groups. This is part of the reason why. They were scared, the white slave owners were, that they would meet in large groups and then organize to cause rebellions. They also, in some states, were not even allowed to grow their own food. They had to rely statistically just on their master.